I wasn't looking for a single lost civilization when this began. I was comparing ruins that were never supposed to belong together. Stone platforms in one region, impossible masonry in another, maps preserving names history no longer accepts, monuments built at scales official timelines struggle to explain. At first, they seemed like separate mysteries filed under separate eras, but the deeper I went, the less convincing that separation became. The same structural logic kept surfacing, the same gaps between what survived in stone and what survived in records. And eventually, a more disturbing possibility emerged. Maybe these civilizations were never isolated at all, only broken apart in memory. I began this investigation assuming the similarities between lost civilizations were mostly aesthetic. That was the reasonable position. Egypt had its own dynasties, its own gods, its own monumental language. The Andes belonged to another continent, another people, another history entirely. The ruined compounds of Central Asia, the Cyclopean masonry of the Mediterranean, the elevated stone platforms scattered through deserts, mountains, and jungles were all supposed to represent separate human experiments, each shaped by local needs and local beliefs. That is how the story is usually told. Many civilizations, many rises, many collapses, and no deep connection between them beyond the broad capacities of the human mind. But the structures themselves do not always cooperate with that version of history. The first thing that unsettled me was not simply size. History is full of large stones, large temples, large ambitions. It was proportion. Repeatedly, in places with no accepted relation to one another, I kept finding the same sense of scale pushed beyond symbolism and into function. Doorways too high to be merely elegant, staircases too broad to be merely ceremonial, foundations too massive for the buildings later occupying them, platforms and retaining walls whose dimensions suggested routine use, not occasional display. In one city, that might be dismissed as grandeur. In another, as ritual architecture. But when the same disproportions repeat across continents and centuries, the explanation begins to feel less like an answer and more like a label. Then there was the geometry, not identical design, not copied ornament, but the same underlying discipline, axial planning, cardinal orientation, repeating ratios in sacred and administrative spaces, elevated sites chosen not only for defense, but for oversight. Long terraces, straight causeways, foundation grids, stone joints cut with a precision that later societies often preserved without clearly matching. The official view treats these as parallel achievements, independent invention, similar solutions to similar problems. Sometimes that is surely true, but the deeper I went, the harder it became to ignore how often these achievements appeared not randomly, but in dense clusters of engineering, proportion, and placement that seemed to obey a logic older than the names later attached to them. That was when I stopped looking only at monuments and started looking at what surrounded them. Old roads, water systems, quarry marks, terraces, administrative placement. The quiet infrastructural details that tell you whether a site was built as an isolated statement or as part of something larger. Again and again, the same impression returned. These places did not feel like singular miracles rising out of empty landscapes. They felt inserted into existing frameworks. A citadel positioned for command. A temple standing on a platform older than its visible walls. A later palace reusing stones and alignments it did not originate. In Peru, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Central Asia, even in fragments of colonial-era foundations laid over older substructures, the pattern repeated. Surface identity changed, but the deeper geometry remained. Maps made that unease worse. When you compare older cartography carefully, not for decoration, but for remembered spatial order, an unsettling habit appears. Regions are named with confidence in one century and softened into uncertainty in the next. Large territorial identities persist across atlases, encyclopedias, and administrative references, then dissolve as if they had never represented anything stable at all. Tartaria is the name most people recognize, but it is hardly the only example of geography remembered more clearly by maps than by later textbooks. Earlier cartographers often seem to preserve broad civilizational space long after official narratives stop preserving broad civilizational memory. That matters, because once a map preserves continuity where history insists on fragmentation, every ruin inside that space begins to look different. A site is easier to explain when treated as local, harder when placed inside a larger field of recurring structures, recurring scales, recurring engineering decisions. A megalithic wall is one mystery. A chain of them, spread across regions history insists were disconnected, is another. An elevated ceremonial center can be explained as local religion. But when similar centers repeat the same placement logic, the same water intelligence, the same disproportion between surviving architecture and surviving records, the question changes. You are no longer asking what one civilization built. You are asking whether multiple civilizations inherited pieces of something older. This is where the official narrative becomes strangely dependent on separation. If every site is isolated, then every anomaly can be contained. This culture favored astronomical alignment. That empire preferred monumental stairs. Another society developed advanced stone cutting for ritual reasons. Another built on high ground for symbolism and defense. Taken individually, each claim sounds plausible. But plausibility is not coherence. And coherence is where the standard model begins to weaken. Because when the same types of anomalies recur everywhere, the historical record thins out. Oversized foundations, unexplained substructures, inherited platforms, enduring geometric discipline, missing construction detail, the repetition itself becomes evidence of pattern. I kept returning to one word, compatibility, not sameness. These civilizations were not identical. Their myths differed, their rulers differed, their decorative languages differed. But beneath those differences, their surviving structures often looked strangely interoperable, as if later cultures were not creating entirely separate worlds, but occupying regional versions of a larger one. The way conquerors inherit administrative centers, the way religions repurpose sacred ground, the way empires place new names over old routes without changing the routes themselves. Again and again, the visible identity changed faster than the underlying system. That would explain more than historians are comfortable admitting. It would explain why later dynasties so often appear better documented in ornament than in origin. Why myths from unrelated regions speak of first builders, elder teachers, vanished ages, or founding peoples standing just outside recorded time. Why the most technically confounding works are so often assigned to remote antiquity, then surrounded by later inscriptions, later rulers, later symbolic meanings. Why conquerors seem to inherit strategic locations they did not choose from scratch, and why monumental competence often appears earliest, while the record grows clearer only after the hardest engineering questions should already have been answered. Seen from that angle, the ancient world stops looking like a graveyard of isolated civilizations. It begins to resemble the damaged surface of something once coordinated. Not necessarily a single empire, not necessarily a single language, creed, or throne. Something more distributed and more durable than that. A civilizational framework. Multiple centers operating within shared principles of measurement, placement, movement, and construction. A system capable of spanning cultures without erasing local identity. A system remembered in stone long after it was forgotten in writing. If that sounds extreme, consider the alternative. We are asked to believe that civilizations divided by oceans, climates, and officially accepted timelines repeatedly produced the same categories of anomalies, the same disproportionate scales, the same unexplained infrastructural intelligence, the same mismatch between surviving works and surviving documentation, and the same lingering sense that the visible remains belong to a deeper story no one can fully reconstruct. That is possible, but another explanation is possible too. And once it enters the frame, history begins to change shape. Lost civilizations no longer look like separate failures ending in separate silence. They begin to look like fragments left behind after the collapse of an organizing logic we no longer know how to name. The ruins do not prove that system existed, not yet, but they do something more dangerous. They make its absence increasingly difficult to defend. If such a system existed, it would not survive most clearly in stories. Stories are fragile. Names shift. Dynasties exaggerate. Priests localize what they inherit. Conquerors absorb older meanings and attach them to new gods, new rulers, new flags. But stone behaves differently. Proportion behaves differently. Roads, terraces, quarries, hydraulic channels, administrative placement, and foundational geometry survive political collapse with an indifference that official memory rarely matches. That is why I stopped asking first what ancient people believed and started asking what their surviving structures were designed to do. What kind of world leaves behind the same monumental logic in places history insists were never part of the same design? The obvious answer is transmission. Civilizations copy one another. Traders carry measurements. Pilgrims carry symbols. Conquerors carry craftsmen. Ideas move farther than armies, and techniques often outlive the states that first developed them. That explains part of the picture, but not all of it. Transmission alone does not fully explain the deeper consistency. The recurring sense that many famous ruins were not merely inspired by earlier models, but inserted into a framework already waiting for them. Again and again, I found later occupations sitting on older substructures, later identities attached to more sophisticated foundations, decorative explanations layered over engineering choices that felt practical before they felt symbolic. That is where the possibility becomes difficult to avoid. Not a fantasy empire ruling every horizon, not a single crown over the whole ancient world. Something more durable than political control, a distributed civilizational order, multiple centers, regional cultures, shared standards, shared placement logic, shared assumptions about movement, water, scale, visibility, and command. In that model, what we call lost civilizations were not isolated miracles appearing independently in different corners of the world. They were surviving nodes of an older framework whose connective tissue has been broken, renamed, and gradually reduced to myth. And suddenly, many long-standing mysteries stop behaving like accidents. Why do so many monumental sites appear chosen not just for beauty or defense, but for oversight? Why do roads, terraces, and retaining works so often imply organization at scales later populations struggle to explain? Why do some ruined cities feel less like spontaneous settlements and more like installations placed into terrain according to principles of control? Why do hydraulic systems, quarrying methods, and foundational platforms often seem older, stronger, and more intelligently integrated than the decorative cultures later associated with them? The standard answer is that ancient societies were simply more capable than modern prejudice allows. That is true, and it matters. But capability is not context. The real question is what broader order made so many distant achievements feel structurally related. This is why erased geography matters so much. Old maps do more than record names. They preserve assumptions about how space itself is organized. When a vast territory appears repeatedly across atlases, encyclopedias, and administrative references, that persistence means something, even when later historians debate what, precisely, the term described. Tartaria matters less as a perfectly defined state than as evidence that earlier cartographers remembered large spatial orders, later history compressed, nationalized, or dismissed. The same may be true of other vanished designations. Lost names may not point to imaginary lands. They may point to forgotten ways of organizing a connected world. And if those categories were lost, then many civilizations now treated as separate may once have been understood as parts of a continuous field. That possibility explains the strange combination of memory and amnesia surrounding ancient ruins. The structures remain, but their logic is fragmented. The placements remain, but their relationships are obscured. Later powers inherit the shell and supply new stories suited to local legitimacy. Temples become churches. Platforms become palaces. Fortifications become ceremonial sites. Administrative compounds become royal residences. Sacred routes become roads whose original purpose is no longer remembered. The system does not vanish in a single catastrophe. It decays through reuse. It survives in fragments while the explanation that once united those fragments disappears. Over time, continuity becomes invisible. What appears to us as civilizational separation may actually be separation of interpretation. We may not be living after many unrelated worlds at all. We may be living inside the reused remains of one long, interrupted one. That would explain why history often feels strangely front-loaded with competence and back-loaded with explanation. The largest works stand at the foggy edge of chronology. The strongest foundations are frequently the least documented. Later eras describe, repair, occupy, rename, and mythologize more often than they truly originate. They inherit the visible world, but not always the full understanding of how that world was first assembled. And if that is true, the greatest loss was not territory. It was comprehension. A civilization can survive invasion. It can survive dynastic collapse. It can survive migration, ruin, and even partial abandonment. What it cannot survive intact is the loss of the conceptual map that tells later generations what its systems are for. Once that map is gone, inheritance becomes confusion. Descendants preserve fragments, ritualize fragments, weaponize fragments, imitate fragments. Eventually, they call the whole thing legend, because legend is what a broken system becomes when its operating logic has been forgotten. That possibility is disturbing for a reason. It does not merely challenge dates or builders. It challenges the emotional architecture of history itself. We prefer a world made of separate civilizations because separate civilizations are easier to teach, easier to classify, easier to claim. Distinct origins give modern nations clean ancestors. Distinct collapses keep the past neatly divided. But a connected ancient system would do the opposite. It would blur ownership. It would complicate inheritance. It would suggest that many of the beginnings later societies celebrated were not true beginnings at all, but occupations, restorations, and reinterpretations. Perhaps that is why the fragments are tolerated only while they remain fragments. An oversized platform can be admired. Anomalous masonry can be debated. A vanished map label can be dismissed. An impossible water system can be praised as ingenuity. A myth of elder builders can be filed away as symbolism. But when those elements are placed side by side, something changes. The question is no longer whether one site is unusual. The question becomes why the same forms of strangeness recur wherever the official record grows thin. At that point, skepticism should not end inquiry. It should begin it. I am not claiming certainty. Too much has been renamed, buried, rebuilt, and reassigned for certainty. But the pattern is real. The compatibility is real. The repeated gap between surviving structures and surviving explanations is real. And once that is admitted, one final possibility becomes difficult to ignore. What if the system that connected lost civilizations never truly disappeared? What if it survives as architecture without memory, geography without context, infrastructure without attribution, and foundations still carrying the weight of later worlds? Then the past is not dead beneath our feet. It is still here, partially occupied, partially misunderstood, and still visible in the places history has trained us not to connect. The stones remember, the alignments persist, the old routes remain, and the more closely you look, the less these ruins resemble isolated mysteries fading into silence. They begin to look like surviving pieces of one world, still waiting for someone to ask why they fit together so well.